Okay, so we're diving deep today into a study you sent over,
Right.
and it's called Reflecting the Energy Transition from a European Perspective
Mm.
and in the Global Context, Relevance of Solar Photovoltaics, Benchmarking Two Ambitious Scenarios.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is, huh?
Yeah.
But the heart of it is you're really trying to figure out what the future of Europe's energy looks like
Yeah,
and the role that solar power could play.
exactly.
You're looking for some clear answers on this whole energy transition thing and maybe what the smartest, most cost-effective paths forward are.
Absolutely.
And so that's what this entire deep dive is all about. We're going to be pulling out the really key insights from this study, especially about solar PV, and try to understand, what they could mean for Europe and really the rest of the world.
And I think one of the things that's so interesting about this study right off the bat is just how ambitious it is.
Yeah.
It's not just looking at solar PV in isolation.
Right.
It's really trying to understand its potential within the entire European energy system
right.
and how that then fits into the global picture. So what the researchers set out to do was to estimate just how much solar PV could realistically and cost effectively contribute to both electricity generation, but also the total primary energy that we use in Europe.
Yeah, and to do that, they painted two really different pictures of the future for Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got this one scenario, the moderate scenario, where the goal is for Europe to have zero net CO2 emissions by 2050.
Okay.
And then there's this other one, the leadership scenario, which is even bolder, even more ambitious, where they're pushing for that same goal, but by 2040.
Wow.
And the really key thing here is both of these scenarios are based on making a complete switch to 100% renewable energy.
That's ambitious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as we go through this study, we're really going to be trying to understand, what could happen in these two possible futures.
Right.
And especially, shine a spotlight on what happens to solar power in those scenarios.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to remember why this study is even necessary right now. The authors emphasize that Europe and, frankly, the world is grappling with multiple energy crises all at once.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just climate change anymore,
Right.
although that remains a really critical driver.
Yeah.
We're also facing energy security concerns. We've got volatility in energy prices,
Yeah.
and fundamentally, a need to just build a truly sustainable energy system for the long haul.
And that feeling of urgency comes through so strongly in the study.
It does.
And they connect it really clearly to the European Green Deal,
Uh-huh.
which has this, big target of zero CO2 emissions by 2050.
Right.
But what's so interesting is the study also points out that the impacts of climate change are themselves making it just crucial that we get off fossil fuels faster.
Yeah.
And then they take this really interesting little historical detour,
Oh, really?
and they remind us about some of the early thinking around 100% renewable energy systems, both in Europe and globally.
And they specifically mentioned this guy, Bent Sørensen, who was doing this groundbreaking work back in the 1970s.
Oh, wow.
Already forecasting this, big role for solar PV.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable how far back some of these insights go.
Yeah.
And I think if we connect it to the bigger picture that this study's presenting,
Uh-huh.
Sørensen's work initially in the 70s for Denmark and then his broader global analysis in the 90s
Right.
was really emphasizing that we need a fundamental energy shift. And he saw this just incredible potential in solar energy.
Yeah.
And the fact that he even envisioned back then solar PV reaching up to 77% of global electricity supply is astonishing.
Yeah.
And that's something that this study highlights as really prescient.
Totally. And then the study takes us on this kind of roller coaster ride through Europe's experience with solar PV.
Oh, interesting.
They point out that in the 2000s, Europe, especially Germany, was a real pioneer.
Yeah.
Not just in the research, but also in putting policies in place like those early feed-in tariffs.
Right. And for a while, Europe was really dominating the global PV deployment. But then the study doesn't shy away from talking about what went wrong.
Oh,
They call it out.
okay.
They talk about these massive policy failures that led to the decline of the European solar PV industry.
Oh, wow.
Jobs were lost, the rollout slowed down. And it's this, kind of sobering reminder that those past decisions have actually contributed to some of the energy security headaches we have today.
Right, and I think this raises a really important question,
Yeah.
which the study implicitly addresses, which is the need for consistent and really forward-thinking policy.
Yeah.
Europe had a real advantage.
Uh-huh.
And as the study kind of suggests, miss some crucial opportunities.
Yeah.
And the consequences of that became really clear with those energy price spikes and security concerns in the early 2020s.
Right.
a more robust foundation of domestically produced solar and wind power could have really provided a much stronger safety net.
It's a good point, yeah.
Yeah.
But the story doesn't end there, thankfully. The study highlights this recent, resurgence in ambition.
Oh, good.
And it's fueled by a couple of things.
Okay.
One is this growing awareness of climate change,
Yeah.
especially, the push from younger generations.
Right.
And then also that wake-up call of the Russia-Ukraine war
Mm.
and how that impacted energy security.
Yeah.
So all of this has led to, big initiatives like the European Green Deal,
Mm-hmm.
and then specifically for solar, the EU solar strategy,
Mm.
which has this goal of reaching 750 steady W of solar capacity by 2030.
Wow. So they're really trying to get back in the game?
It seems like it, yeah.
Yeah.
And what I found really interesting about how they frame this renewed ambition is that it's not just about setting these targets for how much solar to install.
Mm-hmm.
The study also points out that they need to address the whole solar PV value chain.
Oh, okay.
So everything from supporting rooftop installations all the way to building up domestic manufacturing and creating more resilient supply chains.
Right. So it's a much more comprehensive approach.
It seems like it, yeah.
Yeah. And it kind of suggests a deeper understanding both of the challenges and the rewards this time around.
Yeah, it's like they've learned from those past mistakes.
Exactly.
Okay, so the study makes a really clear case for why this energy transition with a big role for solar is crucial.
Right.
But now let's get into how they actually went about studying these future possibilities.
Okay.
And they use this really complex tool called the LUT Energy System Transition Model.
Yeah. The LUTESES.
LUTESTM.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah.
What makes this model tick?
Sure. So the LUTESTM is a really sophisticated piece of modeling.
Okay.
And for you to understand why its findings on solar are so significant, there are a couple of key features to keep in mind.
Okay.
First, it operates with this incredibly detailed hourly resolution across 20 interconnected regions in Europe.
Okay.
So it's really looking at things hour by hour in all these different locations. And that's vital for accurately assessing how these variable renewable energy sources like solar and wind
Right.
can actually be integrated into the grid.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The second key thing is it features full sector coupling.
Okay.
Now think about energy use in your own home.
Uh-huh.
You've got electricity for your lights,
Yeah.
heating for comfort.
Yeah.
Maybe you drive a car that uses energy.
Right.
Sector coupling means the model looks at all these different energy demands, power, heat transport, and how they all interact within the system.
So it's not just looking at the electricity grid in isolation then.
Exactly. It's this holistic view of the entire energy system,
Okay.
much like how you experience energy in your daily life.
That makes sense.
And the study highlights that the LUTESTM is considered one of the most advanced models specifically for analyzing energy systems that aim for 100% renewable energy.
Wow.
It's been rigorously tested, and it consistently ranks very highly for its capabilities in this area.
Okay, so they've got this incredibly detailed model. How do they actually go about using it to explore these different scenarios?
Right. So they take a two-stage approach.
Oh.
The first stage focuses on what they call prosumer simulations.
Okay.
And this looks at the cost effectiveness of individuals and small entities, like homeowners with solar panels or local businesses,
Right.
generating and consuming their own energy and heat across Europe.
Okay, so that's stage one.
Stage one.
And then stage 2.
Stage two, they take those insights from the prosumer level
Uh-huh.
and build a model of the entire centralized energy system.
Okay.
And this includes a really wide range of technologies.
Mm.
Everything from renewable energy generation of all sorts
Uh-huh.
to different types of energy storage,
Okay.
the infrastructure for electricity transmission,
Right.
and importantly, those power-to-X technologies, which we'll talk about more later.
Okay, so it covers the whole gamut.
The whole gamut.
Can you give us a little bit more detail about the specific technologies that they included in this model?
Sure. So the study provides a pretty thorough list.
Okay.
On the energy generation side, they obviously model various renewable energy sources,
Right.
like solar, wind, and hydro,
Uh-huh.
but they also include existing fossil fuel and nuclear power plants,
Uh-huh.
recognizing their current roles, although, of course, their future depends on the specific scenario.
Right.
For heating, they look at both renewable options,
Mm-hmm.
like heat pumps and solar thermal,
Uh-huh.
as well as traditional fossil fuel-based heating.
Right.
Energy storage is a big piece.
Yeah.
So encompassing electricity storage, like batteries at different scales,
Okay.
but also storage for heat
Hmm.
and even gases.
Interesting.
And then a key category is power-to-fuels technologies.
Uh-huh.
These are the processes for creating synthetic e-fuels.
Okay.
And of course, they include the infrastructure for transmitting electricity across regions.
So all the key players.
Oh, the key players.
Okay, so we've talked about the two main scenarios, the moderate and the leadership,
Right.
both aiming for 100% renewables.
Yeah.
But they also include this third one, the laggard scenario.
Uh-huh.
What was the point of including that in their analysis?
Yeah, so the laggard scenario really serves as a kind of benchmark or a what if we don't act decisively pathway.
Okay.
In this scenario, they assume that existing fossil fuel and nuclear power plants would just continue to operate until they reach the end of their typical lifespan
Okay.
without any accelerated shutdowns.
Got it.
Electric vehicle adoption would also be slower,
Uh-huh.
so cars with internal combustion engines would stick around for longer.
Yeah.
They even consider the possibility of some new fossil fuel and nuclear capacity being added based on projections from the European Commission.
Interesting.
But crucially, the laggard scenario does not achieve climate neutrality by 2050.
Oh, wow.
It only manages to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 90% compared to 1990 levels.
Okay.
So it's essentially painting this picture of a future where the energy transition happens much more slowly and with less ambition.
Yeah, it's like the business as usual almost.
Yeah, business as usual.
Okay. And to be clear, they're using the same basic assumptions about how much energy Europe's going to need in the future and the overall potential for renewables for all three of these scenarios.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
So the different outcomes that we see in terms of emissions reductions and the role of different technologies,
Uh-huh.
they primarily arise from those differing levels of commitment to phasing out fossil fuels and nuclear
Yeah.
and the speed at which Europe transitions to a fully renewable energy system.
Okay, so let's get to the really exciting part.
All right.
The core findings, and
Yeah.
especially those that are relevant to solar PV.
Okay.
So what did they conclude about how much solar could contribute to Europe's energy future?
Well, the central finding is really quite remarkable.
Okay.
In both the moderate and the leadership scenarios, they project solar PV reaching a share of 61% to 63% of total electricity generation
Wow.
by 2050.
That's a huge chunk.
It is, and the authors themselves emphasize in the study that this is the highest share for solar PV ever estimated for Europe in all the scientific literature they review.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot bigger than I would have thought.
It is, and if we bring in the global context as well,
Okay.
which the study aims to address,
Yeah.
they mention that the highest average solar PV shares projected in other independent studies, looking at the global energy transition,
Yeah.
range from about 75% to 77%.
Okay.
So that comparison suggests that even with these ambitious projections, Europe might still have room to further increase its reliance on solar PV.
Yeah, to get up to those global levels.
Yeah, if it aims to align with the most ambitious global scenarios.
Okay, so it's not just about powering our homes and businesses either.
Right.
What does it say about solar PV's contribution to the overall primary energy supply?
Yeah, so they found that by 2050, solar PV's share in Europe's total primary energy supply reaches a very significant 54% to 56%
Wow.
in both the moderate and leadership scenarios.
Okay, so it's not just electricity, it's really becoming the dominant energy source.
Across the board, potentially, yeah.
So what are the reasons that are driving these really high solar PV shares in their projections?
Yeah, so they point to a few main factors.
Okay.
Firstly, the model they use, the LUT-ESTM, operates based on cost optimization. So it's selecting the most economically efficient mix of technologies
Right.
to meet Europe's energy needs.
Makes sense.
Secondly, the model incorporates the latest data and significantly lower cost projections for solar PV technology.
Yeah.
As solar becomes cheaper, the model naturally favors it.
Okay.
And thirdly, these high shares are enabled by the integration of different energy sectors, particularly through power-to-X technologies,
Right.
which we'll talk about more later.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
But these new applications essentially create this massive demand for clean electricity,
Uh-huh.
which solar PV is well positioned to provide.
So as the cost comes down and there are more ways to use that clean electricity, It just drives more deployment.
Exactly.
Okay. And they also talk about the sheer amount of solar PV capacity that would need to be installed.
Yeah.
What kind of numbers are we looking at?
It's a really massive increase.
Okay.
They project a range of 740 to 8,820 GW of installed PV capacity in Europe.
Wow.
To give you a sense of scale, the total installed capacity in Europe today is a small fraction of that.
Yeah.
So this figure really underscores the scale of the transformation that's envisioned in these scenarios.
That's a huge amount.
It is.
And geographically, where do they see most of this capacity being located?
Yeah, so their regional analysis indicates a clear concentration of solar PV capacities in the southern regions of Europe,
Okay.
primarily because of the better solar resources there.
Yeah, makes sense.
More sunshine throughout the year.
Right.
And conversely, they tend to deploy more wind power capacity in the northern and western parts of Europe, where there's generally better wind conditions.
So they're playing to the strengths of each region.
Exactly, playing to those natural advantages.
One thing that really stood out to me was they mentioned that the projected amount of electricity generated by solar PV is actually a lot higher in this study
Yes.
than what previous research has suggested.
Uh-huh.
Why is that?
So they project this very high absolute solar PV electricity generation
Okay.
in the range of 10,600 to 12,345 TWh.
Okay.
And they explain that this is mainly because their model takes a really comprehensive view of all energy demands across sectors, not just electricity.
Right.
And then Europe's increasing ambition towards energy self-sufficiency plays a big role. So this drive for independence necessitates large-scale domestic production of e-fuels,
Right.
which, as we'll discuss, require enormous amounts of clean electricity.
Okay.
And solar PV emerges as a leading source for that.
Okay.
So those higher generation figures in the study reflect this push for self-reliance and the energy demands of a future power-to-X economy.
Which brings us perfectly to the concept of a power-to-X economy.
Yes.
The study emphasizes this as a really central feature of Europe's energy future.
It does.
And they even hint that globally, it could become a solar-to-X economy. Can you break down for us what exactly this power-to-X idea entails?
Sure. So at its core, a power-to-X economy means using renewable electricity, increasingly from solar and wind,
Yeah.
not just to power our homes and electric vehicles directly, but also indirectly to create other valuable energy carriers and chemicals. So the X in power-to-X represents those various outputs.
Got it.
And the key process often involves using renewable electricity to produce hydrogen through electrolysis.
Okay.
And then that hydrogen can be combined with other elements like captured carbon dioxide to synthesize a range of e-fuels, such as e-hydrogen itself, e-methane, which is essentially synthetic natural gas, e-liquids, e-ammonia, and e-methanol.
So there's a whole family of these e-fuels.
All family, yeah.
And then they can be used in sectors that are hard to electrify directly, like shipping and aviation.
Like long-distance transport.
Okay.
Also some industrial processes.
So in this system, hydrogen becomes a really critical intermediary.
It does.
Okay.
The study highlights hydrogen's vital role as this intermediate energy carrier because solar and wind are variable.
Right. The sun's not always shining.
Exactly.
The wind's not always blowing.
Hydrogen acts as a way to store that energy.
Okay.
So when there's an abundance of renewable electricity, it can be used to produce hydrogen, which can then be stored and used later to either generate electricity or, more importantly, in the context of this study, to synthesize those e-fuels, providing a more consistent near baseload supply.
Yeah, so it helps to smooth out those fluctuations.
Exactly.
But the study also points out that using electricity directly is often more efficient and cost-effective than converting it into something else.
Yeah.
Does that limit how much hydrogen we might actually use directly?
It's an important nuance. While hydrogen is essential for those power-to-X processes that create the e-fuels, the study indicates that direct electrification is more efficient for many end uses where it's feasible.
Okay.
So this suggests that the direct use of hydrogen as a fuel might be somewhat limited, with a larger proportion being converted into these other e-fuels for specific applications where direct electricity isn't practical.
Okay. And what about other technologies like electricity storage? What role do they play in all of this?
So electricity storage, mainly in the form of batteries, is also absolutely crucial for ensuring a reliable power supply when you have all these variable renewables.
Yeah.
And they project that around 20% to 24% of Europe's electricity demand
Okay.
could be met by stored energy by 2050.
Wow, that's a significant amount.
Yeah.
And what about for heating?
For heating, they see heat pumps becoming the dominant technology,
Got it.
powered by clean electricity.
Got it.
And in the transport sector, there's a strong move towards direct electrification for road transport, with those e-fuels that we talked about
Right.
playing a vital role for heavier, longer distance transport, like aviation and shipping,
Okay.
where battery technology currently faces limitations.
All right, so we're looking at this future European energy system that's heavily electrified.
Yeah.
Different energy sectors are all linked together.
Uh-huh.
Solar PV
Yeah,
is,
okay.
is a cornerstone,
Right.
supported by energy storage and this growing power-to-X infrastructure.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the big questions that are always on people's minds.
Okay.
Costs
Yeah.
and emissions.
Right.
Does this transition come with a huge price tag?
Mm-hmm.
And how effective is it at actually reducing those greenhouse gases?
Right. So this is where the study provides some really encouraging findings.
Okay.
It concludes that an accelerated energy transition towards a 100% renewable energy system
Mm-hmm.
is not just environmentally necessary,
Okay.
but also economically attractive.
Interesting.
In fact, the moderate scenario,
Yeah.
which aims for zero CO2 emissions by 2050, actually shows the lowest overall levelized cost of energy by that time.
That's counterintuitive.
It is.
You would think that pushing for an even faster transition would be more expensive.
Right. So while the leadership scenario does have slightly higher total energy system costs
Okay.
compared to the moderate scenario,
Yeah.
it achieves a massive 17% reduction in cumulative CO2 emissions
Wow.
compared to the moderate pathway.
Okay.
And both of these ambitious scenarios show a substantial decline in the levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE,
Uh-huh.
over time,
Okay.
largely driven by those decreasing costs of renewable energy technologies.
Makes sense.
And then on emissions, the results are clear.
Yeah.
Both the moderate and leadership scenarios lead to this sharp decline in greenhouse gas emissions,
Okay.
reaching net zero by 2050 and 2040, respectively.
So the study seems to make a pretty compelling case that this clean energy future, with solar playing a starring role,
Yeah.
it's not just about environmental responsibility. It
Really?
can actually be the most economically sound way to go
Yeah.
in the long run. Yeah.
Now, no energy system is perfect.
True.
And when you have a system relying so heavily on variable sources like solar and wind,
Uh-huh.
it raises those questions about reliability.
It does.
Did they address any potential challenges?
They did.
Or how such a system could actually function smoothly?
Yeah, they specifically looked at the critical aspects of ensuring grid stability
Okay.
through hourly operation analysis
Mm-hmm.
and addressing those seasonal variations in supply and demand.
Yeah.
Their findings indicate that a system with a very high penetration of solar and wind
Hmm.
can indeed be stable and reliable,
Okay.
provided there is sufficient interconnection between different regions to share resources,
Okay.
robust deployment of energy storage technologies
Mhm.
to buffer those fluctuations,
Right.
and the flexible use of those power-to-X technologies
Okay.
to convert and store excess renewable energy.
Makes sense.
They even examine the potential for prolonged periods of low wind and solar generation across Europe.
Oh, the dark doldrums or whatever. The dark lulls. Yeah.
Sparkles, yeah.
And their analysis suggests that those are unlikely to pose a significant threat to the system's reliability
Right.
in a well-interconnected and sector-coupled energy system.
So that's reassuring,
It is.
because that's a big concern, I think, for a lot of people, is what happens when there's just not enough sun or wind
Right.
to meet those energy needs.
And they found that those concerns about extended dark lulls might be overblown in such an integrated system.
So how does this optimistic view of solar PV's potential compare with what other researchers and energy stakeholders are saying?
Yeah, so this is an important point of context that they highlight in the study.
Got it.
They actually compared their projections
Yeah.
for solar PV share
Okay.
with existing scientific literature and various reports from industry stakeholders.
Okay.
And they observed a notable difference. Many other studies and reports tend to project significantly lower shares for solar PV, and they suggest that this discrepancy might be due to a couple of key factors in their modeling approach.
Okay.
Firstly, they've incorporated the latest and often lower cost projections for solar PV technology,
Yeah.
making it a more economically attractive option.
Right.
And secondly, their model boasts this very comprehensive approach to the energy system with detailed sector coupling and a high temporal resolution, that hourly breakdown we talked about,
Right.
which allows them to capture the full potential of integrating those variable renewables more effectively than some other models might.
So they're really pushing the envelope in terms of how much solar could play a role
They are.
in Europe's energy future.
It certainly seems to be on the more ambitious end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Their findings, along with a few other more recent pieces of scientific work, are pointing towards this considerably larger potential for solar PV in Europe
Right.
than what's been reflected in many of the more established energy scenarios.
Yeah.
And when they broaden their view to consider global energy transition studies, they note that regions with more abundant sunshine often show even greater potential for solar PV deployment,
Okay.
further reinforcing the idea that solar could become the dominant global energy source.
All right. Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
Let's try to distill the core message here for our listeners.
Sure.
What's the takeaway?
The fundamental takeaway, as I see it, is the immense and potentially transformative role that solar PV is poised to play in Europe's shift towards a zero-emission energy system.
Right.
This research suggests that solar could become even more central to our energy future than we previously thought, really forming the backbone of a clean, electricity-powered society.
And it's not just a hopeful vision.
Yeah.
This study lays out this pathway that appears to be both environmentally sound and economically viable.
Yeah.
Where solar PV working in concert with wind power energy storage and those Power-to-X technologies can reliably meet Europe's needs while reducing those greenhouse gas emissions.
And that surprisingly high projected share of solar PV really challenges conventional thinking and opens up these new possibilities for how we power our world.
Absolutely. So it really encourages us to kind of reevaluate our assumptions about the future energy mix.
It does.
And think about what this means for energy policy, investments, technological development.
If solar can truly achieve this level of contribution, it has profound consequences for how we approach the whole energy transition.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener.
Okay.
Given these findings, what do you see as the biggest remaining hurdles to actually realizing this solar-powered future for Europe?
That's a great question.
And what actions do we need to take to overcome them?
It really moves the conversation beyond just setting those ambitious targets to really grappling with the practical steps needed for successful implementation.
It's food for thought, for sure.
It is.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
Into reflecting the energy transition from a European perspective and in the global context, relevance of solar photovoltaics, benchmarking two ambitious scenarios.
Quite a title.
It's a mouthful.
Yeah.
Until our next exploration, keep digging deeper.
Keep digging deeper.